USPA, or United States Parachute Association, puts out a fatality report every year, and it actually looks at the previous year, compiling all of those different incidents. And while each year the people are different, the situations are a little bit different, a lot of things are very similar. In this video, I'm going to go through each of the categories and break down what were the details for that particular fatality and what are the lessons that we can learn. So whether you have 10 jumps or 10,000 jumps, this should be worth your time. It just gives us the opportunity to really check what our own habits are and to honestly assess if there are areas for improvement. The full USPA report is publicly available, and I'm going to link it in the description below in case you want to really dive in. Otherwise, let's get to it. The 2025 Fatality Summary put out by USPA. So in 2025, unfortunately, there were 16 fatalities, and on the right you can see the different categories. When we look at the number of fatalities versus jumps made, we have this graph. In orange, you'll see the total jumps per decade, and that's in millions. And then the blue column is telling us how many fatalities there were. So the way we would read this, if we look at 1990s, there are approximately 29 million jumps made in the 90s and 32.3 average fatalities each year. So in the 2020s, where we currently are, so far we've made 35 million jumps this decade, and on average we see about 12.6 fatalities. Now I just told you that there were 16 last year, so we unfortunately are above the average. If we look at the fatality index, this is showing us per 100,000 jumps how many fatalities there are. So if you were to take 100,000 and divide it by 5.98, you would find that in the 60s there was one fatality in approximately every 17,000 skydives. Whereas today, in the 2020s, we are seeing one fatality in approximately 300,000 jumps. So that has definitely moved in the right direction. And that's going to be for a variety of reasons. This is going to be improvements to equipment as well as improvements to training as well. If we compare the fatality rate, we can see that skydiving in the 2020s, we have about 0.34 fatalities per 100,000 jumps. Scuba diving shows about 0.45 fatalities per 100,000 scuba dives. Base jumping, quite a lot of fatalities per 100,000 jumps, 43, especially when you compare it to skydiving. If we break this down by licenses, we can see in the orange is our 10-year average. So on average, we see 2.4 student fatalities, 1.4 fatalities involving an A license holder, same as B license holder, and D licenses, we always have more fatalities per D license holder every year. As we can see in blue, fatalities last year, and I think this has happened one other time in the past 10 or so years, we did not have any student fatalities, so that was great. And every single year that we look at the fatality report, we see very similar stories, and of course 2025 was no different. So as we're going through this report, I would like you to look for patterns. We're going to go through each category, talk about each fatality in each category, and just think about what are the things that we can learn and what are patterns that show up across all of these. So the first category is going to be Canopy Collision. We can see on the right in blue that in 2025, 2 Canopy Collisions make up about 13% of the fatalities that were had, so 2 out of 16. And that's pretty consistent with what the average has been running over the last 20-ish years. We usually see about 12% of fatalities are going to be from Canopy Collisions. So Canopy Collisions are most likely to occur in 2 different parts of the skydive. The first one is going to be right after deployment when there hasn't been enough separation. So if you're tracking, it's just not getting you far enough from other people before deploying. And then the second most likely place for Canopy Collisions to occur is going to be in the landing pattern. Typically, it's going to be near the intersection of the base and final legs. So what happened last year? There was A female who was 48 with 163 jumps and 6 years of experience. She was on a 3-way jump. If we look at her wing loading, 0.9 to 1, this was a fairly conservative wing loading. She entered the landing pattern in the wrong direction, and the notes say that she had actually been counseled on this before. I guess she had confusion in the past as to what to do for an appropriate landing pattern. It doesn't say how many times she had been counseled before. It just noted that this had been brought up with her before. There was another jumper that was entering his downwind leg, and they were flying right at each other. So a collision occurred. Both canopies kind of collapsed, spun a little bit, but then reinflated. There was minor line burn only, and the main parachute was flyable. However, she decided to cut away at 400 feet and pulled her reserve. She also had an RSL, and it was noted that this was properly connected pre-jump, but somehow it got compromised during the collision, and so it released under load rather than actually extracting the reserve pin with the departing main canopy. The reserve did clear the free bag, but it did not have time to fully inflate before she hit the ground. The second fatal canopy collision was on a high-performance canopy flocking jump. So this was a male, 40 years old, who had almost 3,000 jumps in 10 years in the sport. He was, of course, on a high-performance canopy, so small wing at a 2.9 to 1 wing loading. He chose not to have an RSL for this jump. And he was in an organized skills camp. So they were actually doing high pulls, and they were going to have 2 groups of 5 jumpers flying towards each other. One group was going to be performing barrel rolls over the other group. He was actually part of the group that was performing barrel rolls. He had a collision with another jumper during that barrel roll, and it sheared lines from the other jumper's canopy, but that jumper thankfully was able to get under his reserve and land without a problem. He most likely was severely injured on impact because it seems that he was unconscious or maybe just semi-conscious for several thousand feet before he actually got his reserve out. And when he did get the reserve out, though, he was unstable. The reserve entered a spin from which it never recovered. And part of that equation is because his reserve parachute was a pretty small parachute as well, and he was at a 2.0 to 1 wing loading on that reserve. Okay, so what are the lessons that we can learn from the canopy collisions? First of all, landing patterns have got to be predictable, and it's the whole reason that we fly landing patterns is so that we can anticipate what other people are going to be doing. So our landing patterns have to be predictable, and we also have to be where other people would expect us. We need to understand our own equipment and how it works. If you don't happen to know what an RSL or a MARD are, we do have a video on that you should check out. Emergency procedure practice needs to emphasize checking altitude first before taking action, because honestly, sometimes we don't have the altitude or time to be trying to fix problems when we just need to go straight to plan B. This is something that all coaches and instructors, whenever you're teaching students, you really need to emphasize check your altitude first. For all skydivers, whenever visualizing or going through your own emergency procedures as well. And also the cutaway hard deck is 1,000 feet. So you cannot cut away lower than 1,000 feet unless you already have your reserve parachute out and ready to go. Our planned jumps need to leave room for margin of error because just based on my own experience, most skydives do not go exactly how you have planned. So if there's no room for margin for error, then we're asking for trouble. And finally, the size of our reserve parachute. It's really important to consider what size parachute we're going to want when we are unconscious or incapacitated in some way. I know it can be very tempting if we've got small main parachutes to also have very small reserve parachutes, just so we can keep the size of our container to being very small and comfortable. But we really need to think about this question of what size should our reserve parachute be. Okay, the next category is entanglement. So in this case, the jumper will become entangled with an airplane, and it falls into this category, USPA says. And while there have been similar fatalities in other countries. This is the first time that a fatality has occurred in the US that falls into this category. So what happened? This is going to be a male, 35 years old. He was a tandem instructor who had almost 6,000 jumps and 9 years of experience in the sport. He was making a tandem jump from a Cessna 182, an aircraft type that he could have been unfamiliar with when it comes to actually making tandems from them. There is a Y modification that is on the student tandem harness, and this part of the harness was improperly fitted. The instructor had just let it out to maximum slack, so there was a whole lot of slack that was hanging below the student. And when they climbed out, the student got into a position that was really low on the step, and that allowed this Y-mod strap to be hanging too close to the step. The instructor was also filming with a hand cam, and he was only able to push off with one hand. And as soon as they did, the pair were suspended upside down on that step, and they were hanging off that Y modification strap. There was no hook knife available to be able to cut them away. And eventually the instructor dies. However, the student is able to survive when the AED activated. So what can we learn from this? Whenever you're jumping a new to you aircraft, get an aircraft briefing. This happened on a Cessna 182, so one of the really small planes. A lot of times people think that this is like the size of the plane matters. It doesn't matter. So if it's new to you, ask for an aircraft briefing and find out what are the snag points that you need to be aware of. And to be aware that all aircraft do have snag hazards. So whether that's the steps, the struts, the wheels, door frames, whatever, there's always potential entanglement points that you need to know about. Hook knives should be carried on every jump, and indeed a lot of drop zones are now requiring that skydivers do carry hook knives with them. Just know that if you are carrying a hook knife, you should practice using it before you ever need to. And it's more of a plucking versus a slashing that you're going to do. So if you don't know how to use a hook knife, or you don't know when you might use a hook knife, this is a great opportunity to have a conversation with an instructor or SNTA, somebody that you trust. So when it comes to anything that you might be wearing that has a slack adjustment, we need to be sure that it is appropriately fitted, that there is not slack that is allowed to be out that can now be a snag hazard. So as we saw, this could be components of a student tandem harness. It could also be student rigs that have a adjustable main lift webbings. You want to make sure that you've adjusted it properly so that it is a good fit, or any other component out there where you might have slack hanging. You want to be sure that you've taken care of that. And finally, remember that he had a hand camera, and that's probably part of the reason that he had a hard time pushing away from the plane, because he could only use one hand. Remember that capturing the moment on camera is never going to be more important than jumper safety. Okay, so the next category is equipment problems. There were 2 fatalities last year in this category, and as you can see over on the very upper right-hand corner, this is pretty much on average for what we see every year. So the first fatality was a female who was 55, 280 jumps, and 4 years of experience. She was on a 1-to-1 wing loading. Her right toggle failed to release from the cat's eye at approximately 2,500 feet. So it sounds like she went to unstow her toggles and she was unable to unstow the right toggle. The parachute entered a continuous right turn to the ground. Later on, they looked and the cat's eye did show quite a bit of wear. However, emergency procedures were never executed. Both handles, the reserve and cutaway handles, were found stowed. The second fatality involved a male who was 60 years old with a little bit over 500 jumps and 5 years experience. He was doing a solo wingsuit. He had a spinning main parachute that was observed from about 3,000 feet down to impacting the ground. Not sure what caused the spin. Remember, he was on a solo wingsuit skydive. Again, emergency procedures were not executed. So what can we learn from both of these? Number one, we need to know our decision altitude. So for students and A license holders, USPA says that your decision altitude on whether you're going to land your main parachute or execute your emergency procedure should be no lower than 2,500 feet. For B and C license holders, that decision altitude should be no lower than 2,000 feet. And for D license holders, you really need to think about what your experience is, what your currency is, and most importantly, what equipment you're using, and make sure that you have established a very clear decision altitude for yourself. Again, you need to check your altitude first before attempting to fix any problems that you're having. You may or may not have time to try to fix things. And when we're trying to solve our problems, time and altitude compress a lot faster than we would ever expect. So meaning you run out of time, you run out of altitude while you're trying to fix your problems. So because of that, we need to drill our emergency procedures until the response is just completely automatic. Anytime that you are under stress or you are disoriented because perhaps you are spinning under a canopy, deliberate thinking is the first thing to go. And sometimes people just do nothing, as we saw in these two fatalities here. We also need to be inspecting our equipment regularly. Steering lines in particular will wear faster than your suspension lines, and it is possible to replace just your steering lines if it's needed. So look for fraying, shrinkage, worn cat eyes, and if you really don't know, just have a rigger look over your equipment to see what might need to be replaced. Next category, we also had 2 freefall collisions. This was actually unusual. If we again look at the averages in 2025, this accounts for about 13% of our fatalities, and normally it's a much lower percentage. So the first fatality is a male, 47 years old, who had 2,000 jumps and about 5 years of experience. He was acting as the outside videographer on a 13-way at a boogie that he was attending. Another jumper was, according to reports, not in control and struck him from behind while diving towards that formation. And this was approximately the collision happened approximately 25 seconds after exit. The impact incapacitated this jumper immediately. His AAD activated his reserve, but it seems like he was unresponsive the entire time. He was under canopy all the way to the ground. So from the point that he was struck from behind, this jumper may have already been dead. No handles had been pulled, and the other jumper landed without injury. The second fatality was also a male, 62 years old, right around 5,000 jumps and 25 years of experience on a 5-way formation skydive. At breakoff time, there was approximately 10 feet of vertical separation between these jumpers. And they struck another jumper in the head and neck area while tracking away from the formation. That jumper remained unresponsive in free fall, and the reserve deployed at what people on the ground just said was very low. The jumper later died at the hospital. The other jumper landed without injury. So what can we learn from the freefall collisions? AADs have the potential to save lives. And so neither jumper pulled. In the first fatality, the AAD is the only reason that a parachute deployed at all, because remember, this jumper might have just been dead from impact. And we need to be cautious when we're jumping with unfamiliar people. So in boogie type situations, you're going to have a variety of people coming, and you really don't know what their skill level is, what their experience is. And so if you don't know other people's abilities, then we really want to start with simpler jumps until we have a better understanding of what people can and cannot do. We also need to know where everybody is at breakoff. So if there is vertical separation before breakoff, that means you're not going to have people in the same level. So make sure that you are clearing your airspace before you start to track. So last year, there were also 2 medical problems. The first one was a male who was 49 years old, 35 jumps, and pretty much brand new to the sport. He was on a solo skydive. It was observed by other jumpers that he had what seemed to be a normal deployment, but he was observed slumped in his harness at approximately 2,500 feet and slowly was spinning into the ground. An autopsy later revealed that he had severe coronary artery disease. He had a 90% blockage. And so it was concluded that a cardiac event occurred during the skydive, which led to incapacitation. The second medical problem was a suicide. This was a young male who had 65 jumps and also fairly new to the sport with just 2 years of experience. He had a normal exit, free fall, deployment, and initial descent. He was observed by another jumper to be flying a normally flying parachute, and this was below 800 feet that this other jumper saw him. And then he deliberately cut away his main parachute at an altitude that was going to be too low for the AAD to be able to rearm and activate. He had an RSL that had been checked during his gear check, that it was hooked up correctly, but he then at some point disconnected that RSL. He had also previously expressed suicidal thoughts to a friend. So lessons that we can take away from the medical problem fatalities. For the person that had the cardiovascular disease, skydiving is known to stress the cardiovascular system. USPA recommends that jumpers who are 40 and older to have an annual physical, and anybody that has a family history of cardiovascular disease should consider additional testing with their doctor. In 2024, we had a fatality that was pretty much very similar to this. Also a person in over the age of 40 that died because of a cardiac event. And unfortunately, this is also not the first time that a jumper has used skydiving to end their lives. It's happened about 10 times in the past 20 years. So if somebody that you know expresses suicidal thoughts, you really need to take it seriously, and you can call or text 988 to reach mental health professionals that hopefully can help them. Okay, the next category is the no pull category. And as you can see in 2025, this was quite a bit higher than our average has been. There were 3 fatalities in this category. The first 2 are I think, kind of similar. So the first one was just a simple no pull. A male who was 76 years old, about 1,000 jumps and 32 years experience, was on a solo skydive, did not have an AAD. He was found face down with his right arm reaching towards his pilot chute handle, but never actually pulled the pilot chute. And when they did an autopsy, no conclusive medical cause was found. The second fatality was also a 76-year-old male with 230 jumps and 29 years of experience. It was reported that he had been away from the sport for quite some time. So he was a returning jumper who did refresher training and a recurrency jump with an instructor earlier that day. On this jump, witnesses observed that he had stable free fall, but there were no deployment attempts. The AAD did activate, but the reserve pilot chute did not deploy until impact. The third no-pull fatality was a wingsuiter, male, 45. He had about 200 jumps and 7 years of experience. He had just completed a first flight course a few weeks prior, and this was his first wingsuit jump since that course. He was observed to be spinning in a back-to-earth orientation at about 4,000 feet, and again, no deployment. He did have an AAD, but it was not confirmed whether it was wingsuit specific or not. There was a display that showed a black square that was on recovery, so they could not determine if the AAD had actually been turned on or not. And of course, he did not survive impact. So what are the lessons that we can learn from the 3 no-pull fatalities? First is we just have to be honest with ourselves. As we're getting older, our flexibility is going to deteriorate. Our mental faculties are probably going to deteriorate. We're not going to be as fast as we used to be. So whenever there has been anything that has changed, we need to be honest with ourselves and think about if we should actually consider skydiving. As we've seen several times before, wingsuit instability and tumbling is a huge hazard. So first, flight courses really need to emphasize the emergency procedures and recovery procedures for out-of-control flight. We know that AADs have the ability to save lives, and they actually have very dramatically reduced no-pull fatalities over the decades. If you do a majority of your jumps as a wingsuit jump, you might want to consider a wingsuit-specific AAD because standard AADs may not activate during slow-speed wingsuit freefall or flat spins. And just in general, this is one of those things I think a lot of people are not aware of. If you have an AAD, you need to know your numbers. So if you have no idea what the parameters are that your AAD is going to activate after this, go look up your manual. Whatever manufacturer you're using, whatever model you're using, look at the manual, figure out what speed and what altitude will my AAD need to detect before it actually tries to activate the reserve. And in case you were like me and you had no idea that there was a wingsuit specific model, I found that Cypress actually a few years back apparently came out with a wingsuit specific model. But again, check the numbers on your AAD, figure out what altitude, what speed it's going to activate at. The last category is landing problems, and it is actually made up of 3 subcategories. As you can see, typically this is where the majority of the fatalities are going to be occurring, is with landing problems. The intentional low turns, these are going to be people who went out and they had planned on doing a low turn. This is typically your swoopers. The unintentional low turn is somebody that never planned on doing a turn low to the ground, but for whatever reason, something happened and they did end up making a low turn that they couldn't recover from. And a non-turn related death is probably going to be something like your landing hazard. So if you hit a building, if you landed in the water and drowned, that would be considered non-turn related. And happily, in 2025, we actually did not have any non-turn related fatalities. They were all due to low turns. So let's see what they are. The unintentional low turn fatality was a male who was 28, 220 jumps and only 2 years of experience. This was his first jump at that particular drop zone. He was on a 190 square foot parachute, so that put him about a 1.3 to 1 wing loading. The winds apparently were light and variable, and so when they planned their landing pattern, they had planned it for a different direction than when they got out based on what the winds are doing. So the winds had shifted 180 degrees after that load took off. He decided to make a low turn on final approach so that he could match the landing direction of all the other jumpers. He struck the ground in a diving turn and never flared. So what can we learn from this? Number one, a straight-in landing in a downwind direction would be much safer than the low turn that he executed. And again, they said that the winds were light and variable, so a downwind landing with light winds probably would have been the best decision that he could have made. We should be, all of us, practicing our low turn recovery drill. So knowing how to recover from an unintentional low turn before you ever need it could be the difference between walking away and not. If you have no idea what the low turn recovery drill is, please ask an instructor to describe how to go ahead and practice this so that when you're up high, it's one of the drills that you should be performing. And USPA recommends that this is something that all of us should be doing about every 30 days or so. And then finally, this comes back to, he was at a wing loading of 1.3 to 1. He only had about 200 jumps within 2 years. So was that an appropriate wing loading for his experience level? And I don't think that we can say if it is or not, because we really don't know. Those 200 jumps, maybe they were just made mostly in the last few months, and that he was a very super current person and that he was safely downsizing. We have no idea. But perhaps it might have been a little bit too much. So now we get to the intentional low turns. So there are 3 of these. The first one was a male who had almost 26,000 jumps and 24 years of experience in the sport. He was swooping over a swoop pond on, of course, a very small parachute. But even still, at a very small parachute, this was a very, very high wing loading. He was a 3.6 to 1 wing loading. And likely this was his first jump back after several months of inactivity. He initiated a huge turn and finished that final rotation at a point that was just too low to recover. He ended up striking the ground 100 yards short of the swoop pond. And a toxicology report detected recent marijuana use. However, the report makes sure to explicitly state that just because they detected cannabis in the system, it does not establish whether that jumper was impaired or not at the time of his skydive. So we really don't know. We can only speculate at this point. Fatality 2, another male, 42 jumps, 42 years old, about 1,500 jumps and 10 years of experience. He was practicing for a swoop competition. 2.3 to 1 wing loading. He initiated a 450, ended up striking the swoop pond in a steep descent, and it was noted that he had made relatively few jumps per year for his years in the sport. So if we look at, he's got 10 years of experience, but only a total of about 1,500 jumps, and he's trying to participate in a swoop competition. Actually, again, I just really want to point out that we don't know for sure, though. Maybe the last 2 years he had accumulated the majority of those jumps. The numbers alone don't tell us everything. The third fatality was another male with about 1,300 jumps and 8 years of experience on a 2.3 to 1 wing loading. The turn to final was too low. He struck the ground in a steep descent, and it was also noted that this person had actually made relatively few jumps per year for his years in the sport. Same thing. We don't know for sure if those jumps were spread out fairly evenly over the last 8 years, or if maybe he had taken some time off and then was just coming back a few years later. We really don't know. What do we know? What could we learn? That no matter what your experience level, currency matters. Whenever you have a long layoff, whatever jump you're planning on doing, you really want to dial it back a little bit, be a little bit more conservative. The guy that had 26,000 jumps, right? He had taken a recent layoff from jumping, and he still was trying to perform a high performance jump back as one of his first jumps back. Target fixation is real. So the person that was getting ready for the swoop comp, this is likely what happened, that they just got fixated on trying to hit the gates, the swoop ponds, or even if you're just working on your accuracy, a lot of people can get so focused on that landing target for accuracy that you can get like tunnel vision, and then you no longer are taking in those altitude cues that are telling you like, hey, you need to stop this. This last turn is not going to work out. I just need to have a different plan. So you always need to know when to abort. Downsizing without matching currency is dangerous. So high performance wing loadings demand proficiency and frequent jumping, and it's not just a certain number of years in the sport or a certain number of jumps. Finally, skydiving under the influence of drugs or alcohol is completely against FAA regulations. Doesn't matter what your state thinks about it, it is against federal regulations. The report that noted that recent cannabis use in that one fatality is what we're referencing here, and impaired reactions and judgment do not mix with high performance flight, or I would just say do not mix with skydiving in general. USPA is pointing out drugs and alcohol use. I would go even further and say, even if you're taking over-the-counter medication and you know that it is affecting you somehow, making you maybe a little bit sluggish perhaps, that's not the time that you should be skydiving. So whatever substance, if it's impairing your ability at all, you really shouldn't be getting on an airplane, shouldn't be trying to skydive. What patterns can we see across all of the categories? Altitude awareness shows up in several of them. we have to be checking our altitude before doing anything else. Before trying to problem solve, we must check altitude to make sure that we have time to try to problem solve. Second one is currency and preparation. That showed up in several of the categories as well. High jump numbers alone are not going to protect you. Being proficient, being current, that is usually what makes a safer skydiver. Also, equipment knowledge and maintenance. Those were seen in several of the categories. You've got to know your gear. You have to make sure that you're inspecting your gear. And if you don't feel comfortable inspecting it, just have a rigger inspect it for you. And you got to understand what your gear does. Also, we need to look around and look out for those people that are jumping with us. Our emergency procedures have to be automatic. If we have to sit there and think about what we're doing, most likely we are going to possibly we just may do nothing whenever it comes to a stressful situation. So we need to practice our emergency procedures until they are absolutely automatic. And finally, when we're planning our jumps, we need to leave room for that margin of error. Plans that only are going to work when everything goes right, they're not safe plans, but they're also not realistic plans. What isn't in the 2025 report are all the close calls. So these are only fatalities. There are lots of other skydivers that had close calls. Many jumpers were going to end up having permanent life-altering injuries. Because we've got better first aid and medical evacuation, more people, when they have severe injuries, have been able to be kept alive. But survival does not always mean that you're going to recover. So the 2025 fatality summary, again, our fatality index for 2025 is just 0.46. That's an average of one fatality for every 216,875 jumps that are made. So none of what is included in the fatality report is really new information. It's the same themes over and over again. And again, it's worth asking yourself honestly if there are things that you can do to improve. We are a community sport, and it is important that all of us try to continue getting better, especially when it comes to safety. So if you feel like you have gotten any important information from this video, please like it and share it with another skydiver at your drop zone. If you have any questions about anything that we covered, or if you think there's discussion that needs to happen about any of these points, please also leave a comment for us. We'd love to hear it from you. And hopefully 2026 is going to be the year with the fewest fatalities yet. Stay safe.